once peaceful Nordic nation has become the gun murder capital of Europe.
House bombs, international gangs, a billion-dollar drug trade, and a nation on edge. How did Sweden descend from a modern utopia into chaos in the past decade? Sweden now has one of the highest rates of gun violence in Europe, a drastic change from ranking as one of Europe's safest. The country has been taken over by organized crime, which has doubled shooting deaths in the span of 8 years. Many point to 2015 as the trigger point, as world news was plastered with tragic images of Europe-bound refugee boats sinking. Sweden opened its doors to over 160,000 people, the biggest intake in its history. What began as a campaign promoting multiculturalism and progressiveness soon turned into a dark reality.
Sweden is planning to bring forward measures to curb gang crime that's risen to unprecedented levels.
Every year in Sweden, 4 in a million die in shootings.
An overwhelmed system, growing inequality, and a public so desperate for law and order that the army was called in. But how much is immigration really to blame? Or is there a deeper, darker truth to Sweden's collapse than first meets the eye? It's a story that will take us from the Great Depression to the kidnapping of celebrities and a Spotify money laundering scandal. This is how Sweden reached a breaking point after the immigration crisis. But first, if you love to learn about economics, history, and geopolitics, make sure you subscribe to the channel. Now, back to the video. Sweden was once considered Europe's best example of social democracy. The country was built on a strong, flourishing economy that once desperately relied on immigration. Benefiting from being a neutral power in World War II as the 5th largest landmass in Europe, it drew on its natural resources and raw materials to create an export economy. After the dust settled from the conflict, Sweden was perfectly positioned to profit from the post-war boom in rebuilding a shattered Europe. There was only one problem: the economy was suffering from a massive labor shortage. Between the late 19th century and the Great Depression of the 1930s, over 1 million Swedish natives had left, either Europe-bound or across the Atlantic to the United States. As a solution, Sweden looked to its neighbors. Together with Denmark, Finland, Iceland, and Norway, in 1954, the common Nordic labor market was formed. This removed the need for work permits while giving businesses a larger pool of workers to draw from. For Sweden, it meant a huge migration of Finnish workers into the country, tens of thousands each year. Still, though, this wasn't enough. Sweden soon set its sights on international markets to fill its labor shortage. Countries like Yugoslavia and Greece, with a target of 10,000 people per year. Targeted programs were rolled out to help immigrants assimilate into society, teaching the language and enrolling them in education. At that time, immigrants who settled in Sweden enjoyed, on average, higher salaries than native Swedes and were employed at a higher rate. Trade unions strongly opposed this trend. They wanted to protect the jobs and wages of native Swedes. This was the first major problem for immigration policy. The governing Swedish Social Democratic Party had designed a society with a strong trade union and an active government in the labor market, meaning they couldn't ignore these concerns. Trade unions began excluding non-Nordic immigrants from their labor markets, and the government had no choice but to change policy. At the same time, the Swedish economy had become one of the wealthiest in the world, and it was ready to shift from an industrial society into a post-industrial one. That meant higher skilled jobs, and many immigrant workers left struggling to find work. By 1970, when immigration peaked at over 77,000, new immigrants weren't enjoying higher wages or employment like the first wave. Labor migration had been cut, and instead, an era of refugee immigration was beginning. Refugees came from increasingly distant regions: Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia, the Middle East, and Latin America. Sweden's social welfare system had now grown so large that there were fears refugees and low-skilled immigrants would abuse it, taking too much without putting enough back into the economy. In total, between the end of World War II and 2000, the small Nordic country opened its doors to 2.2 million immigrants, making up almost a quarter of the population. The question was, how much more could the country handle before it buckled? The system was pushed to its limits with the outbreak of a European migrant crisis in 2015. A main driver was the Syrian civil war, which was worsening with international intervention, the use of chemical weapons, and widespread destruction, leaving millions without homes. Others were left homeless in Afghanistan, Kosovo, Eritrea, and Albania, facing equally terrifying political violence and seeking refuge in the First World. In early 2015, boatloads of refugees began arriving, and seemingly never stopped. Within 12 months, 1.3 million people arrived on the shores of Europe, most of them through the Mediterranean Sea. When a boat capsized, rescuers failed to make it in time and 800 migrants drowned, the world watched on in horror. Thousands were dying in the Mediterranean, and the international community declared a crisis. Sweden stood in solidarity with refugees. The Prime Minister at the time and leader of the Swedish Social Democratic Party said, "My Europe takes in refugees. My Europe doesn't build walls. Today is not the day to point fingers. It's the time to find solutions." He agreed to accept 163,000 refugees, the most ever recorded. For the most part, the rest of Europe did the opposite, closing their borders, restricting the impact on their national economies, and rebelling against the European Union. In the United Kingdom, the crisis was used as an argument to leave the EU during the Brexit campaign. In Hungary, the government and people rejected the EU's policies to spread migrants across the continent. Politicians pointed to the failures of integration and assimilation, especially in Germany. Germany led by example in 2015, taking in over 1 million migrants. But racial tensions erupted on New Year's Eve when thousands of incidents of sexual assault were reported in cities across the nation. Perpetrators were described as Arab, North African, or dark-skinned, and the police were accused of covering up their ethnicities. Political movements called for mass migration to stop this and the immediate closing of borders. Scandinavia couldn't escape the wind change either. Sweden watched on as its neighbor Denmark made significant changes to its position on immigration, pivoting to deterrence for asylum seekers, worsening the conditions in detention centers, and slashing social support programs for refugees. Polls found that 88% of Swedes didn't agree with how the crisis was managed and resented their government's decision. People were alarmed by the costs. In 2015 alone, the government spent €6 billion on asylum seekers to cover social welfare, training, integration programs, and housing. After having one of the most liberal refugee policies in Europe, Sweden was now ready to change. Voters drifted towards supporting anti-migration parties, like the Sweden Democrats, which had been gaining momentum since the early 2000s. The party took advantage of media coverage to cement itself as the third biggest party in parliament. This support was enough to form a coalition and take power with the moderate party in 2022, appointing Ulf Kristersson as prime minister. One of the main conditions for Sweden Democrat support was reducing refugees. It was quickly cut from 6,400 a year down to just 900, and any behavior that could be viewed as a threat to Swedish values qualified for deportation. The rights of asylum seekers were limited, their status switched to temporary visas, and borders were more harshly policed. Despite curbing refugee numbers, though, it was already too late. On the ground, Sweden was transforming into something unrecognizable. Waves of violence, mafia groups, and streets terrorized by teenage hitmen. The hotspots for crime in Sweden are areas of high poverty, high unemployment, and low education levels, mostly on the outskirts of cities. But this kind of crime is much more dangerous than robbery or assault. An epidemic has emerged in the country: gun crime. It's closely connected to the narcotics trade, which has created powerful gangs who fight their bloody rivalries in public. In September 2023, a huge explosion was set off in the city of Uppsala, blowing apart 5 houses, killing 3 innocent people, and completely missing its intended gangland targets. Gangland wars between 2 criminal networks, known as Foxtrot and Vorbunätverket, have been especially deadly. Foxtrot's leader, an Iraqi Kurdistan man named Rawa Masjid, is connected to several assassinations. He escaped to Turkey before prosecution, where he continued to oversee his drug empire until he was arrested in Iran. Meanwhile, his rivals at the Vorbi network have carried out even higher profile crimes, kidnapping a critically acclaimed rapper who goes by the artist name Einar. And then just a week before he was set to testify, Einar was assassinated. It's part of gangland wars that have enlisted younger and younger soldiers. In Skarpnäck, Stockholm, a 13-year-old was found in the forest, shot. Children, often under the age of 15, are used by Swedish gangs to carry out crimes because they can often avoid prosecution. Over the last decade, 400 people have died from shootings and attacks. In a country of just 10.5 million, this means Sweden now has the second highest rate of gun crime in Europe. Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson has said, "Sweden has never seen anything like it before. No other country in Europe sees anything like it currently." The government is pointing the finger at the failed integration of migrants. One study found that 58% of crime suspects were migrants, especially for violent crimes. Sentences have been extended and the surveillance powers of the police, but some want anyone with a foreign background convicted to be deported. Similar violence is gripping other European countries like Belgium and Holland, where prominent lawyers and journalists have been assassinated. Like the violence ripping through Europe, Swedish gangs are fighting over a drug trade potentially worth billions. Sweden has become a hub for drug smuggling, acting as a transit country for cocaine to travel from Latin America to mainland Europe. Smugglers have taken advantage of relatively low security checks in Swedish ports, like in the small northwestern city of Helsingborg. Last year, a single seizure there intercepted 867 kilograms of cocaine, worth almost $65 million on the street. This year, authorities at the tiny port of Nynäshamn caught an even bigger shipment, amounting to 1.4 tons or $111 million. Some of that money would have been laundered through Spotify, which itself is a Swedish company. Drug networks pay for millions of artificial streams for gang-connected artists, often Swedish rap, and then cash out the clean money, thousands of dollars for each 1 million streams. Gangs, bombings, and gun crime fueled by this enormous underground narcotic economy now threaten to derail Sweden's economy. The head of the central bank has warned that the violence is instability for markets and could spell long-term economic disaster. As the chaos of the escalating gang war has piled up innocent bodies, the Swedish Armed Forces was called in to restore order. The government has promised to crack down on crime. However, the scale and power of these gangs could make the task complicated. A recent newspaper investigation exposed how police officers have handed over confidential information to gangs. In some cases, information directly led to assassinations. With growing inequality, a European cocaine trade worth 10 billion euros a year, and crime spiraling out of control, Sweden's leaders are hoping that cutting immigration can improve the safety and image of the country. Sweden built its modern society using the labor of migrants. 1 in 4 Swedish people have a foreign background. However, the industrial economy of the post-war industrial boom was much easier to integrate into. Now, radical change in education programs is needed if second-generation immigrants have any chance of adapting to the new, knowledge-based economy. At the same time, the government needs to take serious steps to cut off the tons of illegal substances flowing through its ports and dismantle organized crime. If not, Sweden will only fall further into chaotic violence, and closing the border won't be enough. Is it too late for Sweden to save itself? And would you ever consider visiting the country? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth content. We'll see you again in the next one.